Planning to own a coffee shop? You might want to think twice. Not because you shouldn't do it, it's because there's a real gap between what this looks like from the outside and what it actually costs. And that gap is exactly what this video is for. The pitch practically writes itself with the markup alone. A cup of coffee costs pennies in beans, you sell it for $5, and somewhere in that gap is a fortune waiting to happen. And build a warm little community hangout while you're at it. What's not to love? About half of American adults drink coffee every single day, and the ones who do average 3.5 cups. The demand behind this business is about as real as demand gets. Here's the number that doesn't fit that story. The average coffee shop nets somewhere between 2.5 and 7% profit. Not on the cup, on the entire business. About 60% of coffee shops don't make it past their 5th year. So how does a product with a markup that enormous produce margins that thin? That's what we're figuring out today. And the answer has almost nothing to do with the coffee itself, or even the beans it's brewed from. The first cost, the one that scales with how big a dream you're chasing, a coffee cart can start for the price of a used car, a full cafe for the price of a house. A mobile cart or kiosk is the cheapest entry, running $20,000 to $50,000. Smaller footprint, smaller revenue ceiling, but a real way to test a concept before committing to a lease. A full cafe with real seating runs a lot higher, typically $150,000 to $400,000, once you count build-out, equipment, and permits. A drive-thru format, increasingly popular for its speed and lower labor needs per drink, usually starts around $250,000 and climbs from there. Equipment alone, the espresso machine, grinders, refrigeration, typically eats 15 to 30% of your total startup budget. Whichever format you choose, none of that number tells you whether the location can support it. That part gets decided somewhere else entirely. Most cafe leases run 5 to 10 years, locking in a rent figure long before you know whether foot traffic in that specific block will support a coffee shop's thin margins. That's a long time to be wrong about a location. The hidden trap, the one that quietly eats the entire markup you thought you were charging. Labor is the single biggest number in this business, and it's been climbing for years. Labor typically runs 25 to 45% of total operating costs, depending on the source and how tightly a shop is run. Barista wages have climbed hard. The national average now sits at $15 to $18 an hour, up from roughly $12 to $14 just a few years ago. For a small cafe running a typical 12-hour day, total monthly labor commonly lands between $12,000 and $20,000. Once you count the 2 to 3 baristas needed during a morning rush, plus at least one more during the slower midday stretch. That single number explains something that surprises a lot of first-time owners. Why so many of them end up behind the espresso machine themselves for the first year or two. Not out of passion, but out of math. Every hour an owner works the bar personally saves $18 to $25 in wages that would otherwise disappear from an already thin margin. Add rent, which should stay under 15% of revenue, and cost of goods sold running 25 to 35%, and there's very little room left for anything to go wrong in a business this thin to begin with. That's the real explanation behind the 2.5 to 7% margin, and behind the 60% that don't survive 5 years. The markup on a single cup was never the whole story. Small inefficiencies compound fast at this margin. Pouring a little too much milk per drink, scheduling one extra barista than the morning needs, ordering pastries that expire before they sell, each one shaves real points off a margin that didn't have much room to begin with. The real engine, the one that separates a 5% margin from a 15% one, most coffee shops are only running a full business for about 4 hours a day. So if the markup is real, but the margin isn't, where does an operator actually find more profit? The clock. Specifically, everything that happens after the morning rush ends. Coffee shops generate a disproportionate share of their revenue during a narrow morning window. then face a genuine utilization problem for the rest of the day. Expanding afternoon and evening revenue is consistently named as the single most common strategic challenge coffee shop operators face. You can see this exact pattern in a real coffee shop currently for sale in New Orleans. It generates over $767,000 a year, with 200 to 300 customers a day, and it's only open from 7 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon. The listing itself names the obvious opportunity. Simply extending hours to a normal 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. schedule, on top of revenue that's already strong on an 8-hour day. Food tells a similar story. Wholesale pastries carry 50 to 60% margins, some of the best in the building. Prepared food items run a thinner 30 to 40%, still healthy compared to the core business. The operator is actually hitting 12 to 15% net margins, well above the industry norm. Do it by compressing labor down to 35 to 38% and cost of goods down to 26 to 29%, not by cutting rent or skipping insurance to get there. The real money in coffee shops. The markup on the cup was never the business. The business is what happens to your fixed costs, rent and payroll, during the 20 hours a day most shops treat as dead time. That New Orleans listing is worth sitting with for a moment, because it's not a hypothetical model. It's a real business, currently for sale, with real numbers attached. 6 years in operation, 12 employees, a franchise system behind it, revenue that's grown consistently year over year without any additional marketing. And still, according to the listing itself, sitting on a straightforward, unexploited lever. More open hours. Not a new concept, not a rebrand, not more marketing spend. Just capturing revenue during hours the shop currently leaves on the table entirely. That's the gap between an average coffee shop and a genuinely well-run one, in one real, current example. The coffee, the location, the customer base were never the constraint. The clock was. Extending those hours isn't free, of course. It means more labor scheduled across a longer day. But layered on top of a location already proven to work for 8 hours, it's a far safer bet than opening a second, unproven location chasing the same growth. So let's run the two real outcomes. The optimistic case. You run a tight labor schedule matched to actual demand, keep cost of goods under 30%, extend hours to capture afternoon revenue, and layer in a food program with real margin instead of an afterthought bakery case. Net margin lands in that 12 to 15% range the best operators achieve. On $500,000 in annual revenue, that's $60,000 to $75,000 in owner profit, on top of whatever salary you draw for working the business yourself. You track drinks per labor hour and average ticket the way other businesses on this channel track occupancy or turns per day, because those two numbers quietly decide almost everything else that happens on the P&L. The realistic case. You open with a beautiful space and a passion for coffee. Staff generously because a great customer experience matters to you, and the shop essentially closes its doors financially the moment the morning rush ends. Labor creeps toward 40%, rent quietly crosses that 15% line in a slower month, and net margin lands in the industry-typical 2.5 to 7% range. You're open, you're busy every morning, and you're barely breaking even at the end of the year. The shop looks successful from the sidewalk. The line out the door every morning is real. The bank account at the end of the month tells a much quieter story. Same beans, same espresso machine, same neighborhood. The entire gap comes down to whether the afternoon was ever part of the actual business plan. So is it worth it? If you're picturing the markup on a latte as your business model, that number was always more marketing than math. What's true is that this remains one of the most community-centered small businesses on this channel, with a real, survivable path to profit for owners who treat labor scheduling and daypart revenue as seriously as they treat the coffee itself. It rewards a specific kind of discipline that has nothing to do with roasting or latte art. watching a schedule and a clock as closely as you'd watch a recipe. For someone willing to obsess over the clock as much as the espresso, this can become a genuinely strong, durable business. For someone planning to open at 7, close early, and let the markup do the rest, the industry's own average margin is already sitting there, thinner than the fantasy. Remember this: nobody builds real profit selling coffee in the morning. They build it by not letting the other 20 hours of the day sit empty. The espresso machine is the least important asset in the building.